My name is Nora Callum, and I was 31 years old when my uncle stood in front of my grandfather's oldest friends and told them I had signed my share of the family land over to him willingly. He said it the way people say things they have rehearsed until the rehearsal feels like memory.
Calm. Certain.
Slightly aggrieved, as if the fact that anyone was asking at all was the real imposition. She agreed. Ask her yourself. I was standing 12 feet away when he said it. I did not move. I did not raise my voice. I had learned by then that the kind of man my uncle was only becomes more certain of himself when challenged directly, that the argument was not a thing I was going to win in that room, in that moment, with words. What I had was something else. Something that had been sitting in a filing cabinet in the county recorder's office for 30 years, underneath the instrument my uncle had submitted, underneath his version of events. Something older. Something with my grandfather's handwriting on it, and a notary seal from 1994 and a signature line that told a different story than the one my uncle had been telling everyone for 2 years. I did not know, that afternoon, exactly when it would surface. I knew that it would. Welcome back to channel, where quiet people let the original document speak. If you're new here, hit subscribe and drop a comment telling me what brought you today. I read every single one. I need to tell you about my grandfather first because everything that happened, the deed, the forgery, the room in the county offices where it all came apart, begins with him. Not with his death, and not with his will, but with who he was when he was alive and what that meant for the people around him. His name was Harold Callum. He had farmed 61 acres of land in Denton County for 50 years, the same land his own father had broken and cleared and made productive in the decades after the war. The farm had never been large by commercial standards. It was not that kind of operation, not the kind with equipment lines and corporate contracts and spreadsheets managed by someone in an office. It was a working family farm, and by the time I was old enough to understand it, it had 3 active fields, a hay operation that supplied for local stables, a woodlot of maybe 8 acres along the northern boundary, and a farmhouse that had been added to and modified across 3 generations until it had the particular quality of a structure that has been lived in seriously for a very long time. My grandfather was a quiet man. Not shy. He could hold a room when he wanted to, could tell a story across a table full of people and hold every thread of it without losing anyone, but quiet in the sense that he did not spend words carelessly. He said what he meant and he meant what he said, and he was not in the habit of revisiting either. In Denton County, where his family had been for 3 generations, that kind of man accumulates a particular sort of reputation. Not fame, not prominence. Just a reliable gravity. People trusted Harold Callum the way they trusted a fence post that had been driven deep and set correctly, not because of anything dramatic it had done, but because it had been in the same place for decades and had never moved. I am the older of 2 grandchildren on my side of the family. My mother was his daughter, his only daughter, the younger of his 2 children. His son was my Uncle Raymond, who was 8 years older than my mother and had lived his whole adult life in Denton County, the first 20 years of it on the farm itself and then, after his marriage, in a house in town about 4 miles from the property. Raymond is 12 years older than me. When I was a child, he was simply a fixture, a large, loud presence at holidays, the kind of uncle who had strong opinions about everything and delivered them with a confidence that read, to a child, as authority. As I got older, I began to understand that confidence and correctness are not the same thing, and that Raymond's confidence, specifically, was the kind that has never been seriously tested. He had grown up the oldest child, the only son, the one who was assumed to be the future of the farm, and he had occupied that position for so long that it had become invisible to him. He could no longer see it as a position because it had become, in his own understanding, simply the natural order. My mother, by contrast, had left Denton County at 22 and built a life elsewhere. She had married my father, who was an engineer, and they had moved to a city 4 hours away and made their life there. She maintained her relationship with my grandfather. We came back for summers when I was young, and she called him every Sunday without exception for as long as I can remember, but she was not present in the daily texture of the farm's life the way Raymond was, and she had long since made her peace with that. She did not want to run a farm. She wanted to be near her father. Those were different things, and she kept them separate. My grandfather understood the difference too. He was not sentimental about the farm as an abstraction. He did not love it because it was a farm or because it had been in the family. He loved it because it was specific. These fields, this soil, this woodlet with the particular way the light came through the canopy in late afternoon. He worked it because the work was meaningful to him, not because of what it represented. And he thought about its future with the same clear-eyed practicality he brought to everything else. I know this because of the conversations I had with him. When I was in my mid-20s and had established myself in my own work, I am a paralegal, have been for 8 years, working for a property and land use firm in Crestwood. I began coming back to Denton County on my own, not just for family occasions, but simply to visit. I would drive out on a Saturday morning and spend the day with my grandfather, and we would walk the property and talk, and he would tell me things about the land in the way that people tell you things when they trust that you will hold them carefully. He talked about the grant deed. He talked about it more than once, and always in the specific, practical way he talked about everything. He had structured the land so that when he died, it would pass to his 2 children, my mother and Raymond, in equal shares. That was the instrument he had drawn up and filed.
He was explicit about this.
Equal, he said once, and the way he said it carried the full weight of someone who has thought about a thing carefully and arrived at a conclusion that feels correct to him in every direction. Both of them. Equal shares. I did not write this down. I did not need to. I am a paralegal. I understand the difference between what someone intends and what is documented, and I knew what he had told me was consistent with what I understood about how he thought. But I was also his granddaughter, not his attorney, and it was not my place to audit his estate planning. I trusted that what he had told me was reflected in the instruments he had filed. What I did not know was what Raymond was doing. My grandfather died when I was 29. He was 83, and his health had been declining for about 2 years. Nothing catastrophic, nothing that required hospitalization or dramatic intervention, just the slow, steady narrowing of capacity that comes with age when the body has been used hard and well for a long time. He was clear-minded until nearly the end. He knew who he was and where he was and what he thought about things, and the fact that he died in the farmhouse, in the room he had slept in for 50 years, was the outcome he had wanted and the one he got. Raymond was present for most of the final months. He was living in town but coming out to the farm most days, ostensibly to help manage the property and make sure things were being kept up while my grandfather was less mobile. My mother came when she could. She came for the last 3 weeks and stayed at the farmhouse, and I came twice in that period, for a week each time, taking leave from work to be there. What I noticed during those visits was that Raymond had assumed a kind of administrative authority over the property that was expansive in ways that I did not entirely understand. He was managing the hay contracts. He was dealing with the property tax filings. He was coordinating with a neighbor who leased one of the back fields on an annual arrangement. None of this was illegitimate. He was there. He was capable. He had been associated with the farm his whole life, and my grandfather had not objected to any of it. But there is something in the way Raymond operated that I noticed and filed away without addressing directly. He spoke about the farm in the first-person singular. Not, we'll need to sort this, or the family will have to decide. Just I'm going to renew the hay contract. I've talked to the neighbor about the lease. Small things. Not wrong, exactly, but a posture. After my grandfather died, there was a period of about 3 months during which the estate was in process. My mother and Raymond were both named in the primary instrument, which Raymond had located and which confirmed, as my grandfather had always said, that the land would pass to both of them in equal shares. Or so I understood. I was not directly involved in the estate process. I was a granddaughter, not a beneficiary, and my role was supportive rather than procedural. My mother relied on me for guidance because I had the professional background, and I helped her review documents, understand timelines, and know what questions to ask. She was grieving and not in a state to absorb complex legal information easily, and I was glad to be useful. The first sign that something was wrong came about 5 months after my grandfather's death. My mother received a letter from a title company, a routine notification related to the property transfer process, and she forwarded it to me without fully understanding what it said. I read it, and something in the language of it snagged. The letter referenced the estate transfer as being directed to a single beneficiary. One name, Raymond Callum. I called my mother. I asked her whether she had signed anything related to the property transfer. She said she didn't think so, not anything significant. She said Raymond had sent her some paperwork a few months back, shortly after the estate was opened, and had explained that it was standard documentation for the transfer process, some form that both beneficiaries needed to acknowledge, and that she just needed to sign where indicated and return it. What form? I asked. She didn't remember exactly. She said it had been several pages and Raymond had explained it on the phone, and it had seemed straightforward and she had signed it and sent it back. My hands went cold. I asked her if she had kept a copy. She said she wasn't sure. She said she might have a photocopy somewhere, but she hadn't really thought about it. I spent the next week trying to locate the document. My mother searched her files. She found the envelope Raymond had sent, but not the full document. Only the cover letter, which explained that the enclosed forms related to the estate administration and required her signature as a co-beneficiary. The cover letter was cordial and explanatory and contained nothing that was technically incorrect if read in isolation, but which framed the document in a way that would not have prompted a non-specialist to read it carefully. My mother, who is not a specialist, had not read it carefully. She had trusted her brother. I contacted the estate attorney, a general practice lawyer named Dennis Walsh who had been handling the estate administration, and asked what documents had been filed related to the property transfer. He told me that a quitclaim deed had been filed, signed by my mother, transferring her interest in the Denton County property to Raymond Callum. He said it had been part of the estate settlement and had been recorded with the county. I asked him to send me a copy of the document. When I read it, I sat very still for a long time. The document was a quitclaim deed. My mother's signature was on it. The document transferred her 50% interest in the Denton County property, her entire share, to Raymond, in exchange for a stated consideration of $1, which is a legal placeholder that means no actual money changed hands. The document had been prepared by a notary my mother had never met, who had, according to the notarization, witnessed her sign it in person. My mother had not signed it in person. She had signed what she believed to be a routine estate form and mailed it back to Raymond. The notarization was false. But that was the quitclaim deed. That was not the most important document. Because I am a paralegal, and because I work in property and land use law, my first instinct when I encounter a document I don't trust is to find the underlying instrument and compare. And the underlying instrument, the original grant deed my grandfather had filed, the one that established the ownership structure from which everything derived, was a matter of public record, on file with the Denton County Recorder. I submitted a records request. What I received was a copy of the 1994 grant deed. My grandfather had filed it 30 years ago, when he had first formalized the ownership structure of the property. The deed granted the 61-acre parcel to Harold Callum and named both of his children, Raymond Callum and Margaret Callum, my mother, as designated remainder beneficiaries, with equal shares. There were 2 signature lines at the bottom. One for Raymond, as a named party. One for Margaret. The signature on Margaret's line was not my mother's signature. I have seen my mother's signature thousands of times. On birthday cards, on school forms, on documents I helped her process over years of professional work. I know it the way you know something you have looked at your entire life. The signature on the 1994 grant deed was not hers. It was a competent imitation, not sloppy, not obviously fraudulent to an untrained eye, but it was not hers. That deed had been filed in 1994. I had not been born yet when Raymond had filed it, and in it, he had already established a paper trail in which my mother had appeared to agree to terms that she had not agreed to. I did not call Raymond. I did not tell my mother what I had found. Not yet. Not until I had something more solid than a paralegal's read of a document to stand on. I requested a consultation with a forensic document examiner through my firm's professional network, and I waited. The examiner's report came back 12 days later. Her conclusion: the signature attributed to Margaret Callum on the 1994 grant deed was inconsistent with samples of Margaret Callum's genuine signature across multiple authenticated documents. The inconsistencies were not attributable to age, stress, or normal variation. They were structural, systematic, and indicative of a different hand. I now had a report. I had the original deed. I had a false notarization on the quitclaim.
I had a timeline.
What I needed was the right room. Raymond, in the months since the estate had nominally closed, had been operating the property as if it were entirely his. He had renewed the Hay contracts in his name only. He had met with a developer who had approached him about the rezoning potential of the northeastern corner of the parcel, a conversation I found out about through a mutual acquaintance in the county, and had apparently had preliminary discussions about a possible sale of that portion of the land, discussions he had not disclosed to my mother or to me. There was a county agricultural board meeting scheduled for the following month. It was a regular quarterly meeting, open to the public, at which landowners in the county could raise matters related to their properties, boundary adjustments, land use questions, record corrections. It was not a dramatic venue. It was a practical one, a room full of people who knew the land and knew each other, with a county recorder present and a functioning public record system. I asked to be placed on the agenda. The Denton County Agricultural Board met on the second Thursday of the month in a meeting room at the county offices, a practical, unornamented space with fluorescent lights and folding chairs and a long table at the front where the board members sat. It was not a courtroom. It was not designed for confrontation. It was the kind of room where people talked about drainage easements and crop insurance and the maintenance schedule for county roads that ran alongside their property lines, and most of what happened there was procedural and forgettable. The room was about half full when I arrived. I recognized several faces. Neighbors of my grandfather's, people who had known the Callum family property for decades, men and women who had attended my grandfather's service and brought food to the farmhouse afterward. Their presence was not strategic. They were simply there, the way people who have stakes in agricultural county business are regularly there, because these meetings were where things that affected their land were discussed. Raymond was there. He had not known I would be on the agenda. He was seated in the third row with a man I didn't recognize, someone who I later learned was a real estate consultant he had begun working with regarding the potential development sale. When I came in, Raymond nodded at me the way you nod at someone whose presence is unremarkable. The nod of a man who does not yet know that the meeting he is attending is a different meeting than the one he planned for. I sat in the second row with a folder on my lap. The county recorder, a woman named Judith Moss, was seated at the end of the board table. She had been the Denton County recorder for 11 years. She was methodical and careful and had a reputation in county legal circles for knowing her records better than anyone who worked in her office. My firm had dealt with her on several matters over the years, and I had spoken with her directly on 2 occasions prior to this meeting, once when I submitted the initial records request for the 1994 deed, and once when I came in person to review the document with the forensic examiner's report in hand. She had reviewed the report. She had pulled the original deed from the physical archive. She had compared the signature herself. She had not said anything to me in those conversations that went beyond the professional and the procedural.
She was not my advocate.
She was the recorder. But she had also understood, without my saying so directly, what the record showed, and what it meant. The board moved through its agenda. Property adjustment requests. A boundary survey dispute between 2 neighbors that had been going on for 3 seasons. A question about a county road maintenance responsibility. Normal business. I sat with my folder, and I waited, and my breathing was even, and the folder was closed in my lap. When my item came up, the board chair, a farmer named Ted Aldrich who had known my grandfather for 40 years, read my name and the subject I had listed. Record correction request, Callum grant deed, parcel 44 to 117. Raymond's head turned. He looked at me across the room, and something shifted in his face. Not dramatically, not the cartoonish alarm of a man caught in the act, but something more precise than that. The look of someone who has been running a calculation and has just discovered that a variable he thought was controlled is not controlled. I looked back at him steadily. I did not change my expression. The board chair asked if I wanted to approach. I said I did. I came to the front of the room, and I set my folder on the table, and I stated clearly and without embellishment what I was requesting. A review of the original 1994 grant deed on file with the county recorder, specifically the signature attributed to Margaret Callum, in light of a forensic examination report I was submitting into the record. Ted Aldrich looked at the report. He looked at Judith Moss. He asked if she had reviewed the matter.
She said she had.
He asked if she could speak to what the original record showed. She reached into a file she had brought to the meeting and she removed the original 1994 grant deed, the physical document, pulled from the archive, the one that had been on file for 30 years. She set it on the table in front of the board. She put on her reading glasses. She found the signature line. This signature line, she said, and paused. She turned the document toward the table, toward Ted Aldrich, toward the other board members, toward the room, so that everyone present could see the line she was referencing. The signature attributed to Margaret Callum on the original 1994 grant deed is not consistent with authenticated samples of Margaret Callum's signature, she said. I have reviewed the forensic report submitted by Nora Callum, and I have reviewed the document itself. The record as filed does not reflect what the record should reflect. The room went still. Not the polite, procedural stillness of a meeting in progress. The particular stillness of people who have just received information that reorganizes what they thought they were sitting in. Raymond stood up. He stopped. His voice had gone slightly off its register, a fraction lower, a fraction slower than his normal speaking pace, the way an engine sounds when something inside it is changed without warning. That deed was filed 30 years ago. I don't understand what is being implied here. Judith Moss looked at him without any particular expression. I'm not implying anything, Mr. Callum, she said. I'm describing what the record shows. Ted Aldrich asked Raymond to be seated. Raymond sat, and the man next to him, the real estate consultant, leaned toward him and said something quietly, and Raymond shook his head once, a small tight motion, and then he went very still. I stood at the front of the room. My hands were at my sides. The folder was on the table. I had said what I had come to say, and now the room was doing what rooms do when documents tell the truth. What happened next took about 20 minutes of procedural discussion that I will compress for you, because the procedural details are less important than what they produced. Judith Moss walked the board through the chain of record. She showed them the 1994 grant deed, the original, with a signature that was not my mother's. She showed them the authenticated samples from the forensic report. She showed them the quitclaim deed that had been filed during the estate process, signed by a notary who had purportedly witnessed my mother sign the document in person, in Denton County, on a date when my mother had been, as I had documented through phone records and a credit card receipt, for hours away in her own city. She did not use the word forgery. She did not use the word fraud. She was a county recorder, not a prosecutor, and she was doing her job, which was to describe the record accurately and note where the record was inconsistent with authenticated evidence. But what she described, in her careful, methodical language, was a document filed in 1994 with a signature that was not the person's it was attributed to, and a document filed during an estate proceeding with a notarization that the evidence indicated could not be accurate. The board members were quiet throughout this. Ted Aldrich asked questions. The other members asked questions. They were farmers and county officials, not attorneys, but they were not naive, and the shape of what Judith Moss was describing was not difficult to understand. Land was real to these people. Documents were real. The idea that a deed could be filed with a false signature, with a signature forged in 1994 and left in the record for 30 years, was not an abstraction. It was a specific and serious thing. My grandfather's neighbors were in that room. Men and women who had known Harold Callum for decades, who had bought hay from him and lent him equipment and stood at his graveside. Some of them had known Raymond his entire life. The woman seated behind me, I learned her name afterward, Elaine Gorton, who farmed the property adjacent to the Callum parcel on the western side, audibly drew in her breath when Judith Moss showed the board the signature comparison. It was a small sound, involuntary, the kind of sound a person makes when something slots into place that they did not want to see slot into place. Raymond did not speak again during this portion of the meeting. He sat in the third row with his hands on his knees and his jaw set, and his eyes fixed on a point somewhere forward of him that was not quite anything in the room. His color had changed, not dramatically, not a sudden flush or drain, but a slow, progressive change, the way a surface changes when the light shifts. The man next to him had stopped leaning over. He was sitting straight in his chair, slightly apart from Raymond, in the particular posture of a professional who has realized he is in a meeting he did not consent to be in. At the end of the presentation, Ted Aldrich thanked Judith Moss and looked at me and said that the board would be referring the matter to the county attorney's office for review and that a hold would be placed on any pending transfer actions related to Parcel 44 to 117 pending that review. I said thank you. I gathered my folder from the table. I turned and walked back through the room to my seat and then, after a moment, to the door. I did not stop at Raymond's row. I did not look at him directly. There was nothing I needed to say in that room that had not already been said by the documents. Raymond has not spoken to me since. The county attorney's office opened a formal review within 2 weeks of the agricultural board meeting. This is not as fast as it sounds. 2 weeks is actually quite prompt for a county government process, which tells you something about how seriously they took what Judith Moss had presented. The review was not a criminal prosecution. I want to be clear about that because the distinction matters. A county attorney's review of a land record irregularity is an administrative and civil process. Its purpose is to determine what the accurate record is and to correct it, not to pursue criminal charges, though criminal referrals are possible downstream and outside of this story. What the review did, practically, was freeze the property.
No transfers.
No sales. No development discussions. Raymond's preliminary conversations with the real estate consultant about the northeastern corner of the parcel, the conversations I had learned about through the mutual acquaintance, the ones Raymond had not disclosed to anyone in the family, stopped. The consultant, I was told by someone who knew him professionally, withdrew from the matter within a week of the agricultural board meeting. People who work in land development do not stay in situations where the underlying title is in active dispute. My mother retained an attorney. Not Dennis Walsh, who had handled the estate and whose role in the quitclaim process was now part of the review. He had processed the document without, he said, any awareness that the notarization was false, and I believe that is probably true, though his due diligence on the matter had clearly been insufficient. But a different attorney, a woman named Carol Shunn, who practiced property and estate litigation, and who had significant experience with exactly the kind of record correction my mother needed. Carol Shunn was efficient and methodical and did not waste time on anything that wasn't necessary. Within 6 weeks, she had filed the formal correction action on the 1994 grant deed. Within 4 months, after the county attorney's review had produced its findings, which confirmed that the signature on the 1994 deed was inconsistent with authentic samples and that the notarization on the quitclaim deed could not be supported by the evidence, the corrected record was filed. My mother's 50% interest in the Denton County property was restored. The 61 acres, with the farmhouse and the barn and the woodlot and the hay fields, was recorded as belonging equally to Raymond Callum and Margaret Callum, which is what my grandfather had always intended and what his original instrument had always said, before someone had put a different signature on it. Raymond did not contest the correction formally. His own attorney, he had retained one, briefly, apparently advised him that contesting the record correction in light of the forensic report and the county attorney's findings was not a viable path, and Raymond, whatever else he was practical enough to understand when a position was untenable. He did not apologize. He did not reach out to my mother or to me. He did not offer any explanation of the 1994 signature or the notarization of the quitclaim. His silence was total and, I suspect, deliberate. The silence of someone who has understood that anything he says becomes part of a record he does not want to add to. What he lost, beyond the property interest he had tried to consolidate, was harder to measure, but more total. The people in that agricultural board meeting went home and talked to their families and their neighbors the way people in small counties talk. I did not publicize anything. I did not make calls or send messages. I did not need to. The meeting had been public. The record was public. The county attorney's findings were public. In a community where 3 generations of a family had been known, the story moved the way those stories move, not loudly, not with drama, but steadily from person to person, the way water moves through a field after rain, finding every low place. The hay contracts that Raymond had been managing in his own name were renegotiated. The neighbor who leased the back field contacted my mother directly. The preliminary development inquiry on the northeastern corner did not resurface. The consultant had moved on, and by the time the property was in clear title again, the specific rezoning conversation Raymond had been pursuing had run its course, without resolution. My mother came back to Denton County twice in the months after the correction was filed. She walked the property. She stood in the farmhouse kitchen where she had grown up, and she looked out the window at the fields her father had worked, and she was very quiet in a way that had a different quality than her usual quietness. I did not press her to articulate it. I walked the property with her, and I let the fields be fields, and I let her have whatever she was having without narrating it. The second time she came, she said, "He always meant for both of us to have it." I think he knew it needed to be said clearly. He said it clearly. I thought about the conversations I had had with my grandfather. The way he had said equal, with that particular weight, the weight of a man who has thought a thing through completely and arrived somewhere firm. He had said it clearly. He had put it in the document. Someone had changed the document, but the original had still been there, in the archive, waiting. She walked over to the window and put her hand briefly on the frame, the way you touch something to confirm it is real and solid, and then she turned around and said she was going to make coffee, and I said that sounded right. Raymond sold his own house in town about 8 months after the record correction. I don't know where he moved. I heard secondhand, through a cousin, that he had relocated out of the county. I have no information beyond that, and I have not looked for any. The farm still produces hay. The woodlet still has its particular quality of light in late afternoon. The farmhouse still stands exactly where it always stood, on land that my grandfather broke and my mother inherited, and that the county recorder's office has now correctly recorded as belonging to both of them equally, the way it always should have. There is something about land that people misunderstand. They think of it as passive, as a thing that simply exists, that can be managed and transferred and argued over, but that cannot speak for itself.
They are wrong about that.
Land has its own record. The surveys are filed. The deeds are filed, the original instruments are in the archive, and the archive does not forget. You can file something false, and it will sit in the record for years, for decades, and it will look like truth to anyone who does not go back far enough. But the original is still there underneath it. The oldest document in the file is often the truest one, and the county recorder eventually will pull it. My grandfather used to say that land remembers who worked it. What I know now is that land also remembers what was written about it. Every line, every signature, every date. It remembers, and when someone finally goes back far enough to find the original, the record is waiting there with all the patience in the world. That's my story. A grant deed filed in 1994 with a signature that was never my mother's. A county agricultural board meeting where the oldest document in the archive was pulled and turned toward the room. And a county recorder who read the signature line aloud, paused, and then told the room exactly what the record showed. That's what it took. That's all it took.
Before you go, I want to ask you something.
My grandfather put the equal shares in the document 30 years before any of this happened. He said it out loud to me in conversations I held in my memory for years. And when the moment came, the document was there, older than the false one, truer than the false one, waiting in the archive. My question for you is this. Do you think my grandfather suspected something, that the reason he said equal with such deliberate weight, the reason he filed that deed so carefully, was because some part of him understood that it might need to be found someday? Or do you think he was just a careful man doing what careful men do, and the document survived because careful work tends to survive? Drop your answer in the comments. Drop a comment, hit subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one.